Dr. Tim Furnish is our speaker today, and he's going to be speaking on trusting in the tameness of the wolf, Obama's Middle East policy. Dr. Furnish, we're so happy to have you here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, folks. It's an honor to be invited back. I've never been during the week. I think we have more people here than the last Saturday I was here. That's nice. I stole the title of this from Lear. I had never seen Lear, and I finally made it down to the Shakespeare Tavern with my wife last fall and saw Lear. And I'm one of those obsessive compulsive folks that before I see a play I have to read the whole thing. So, and when Michael asked me to speak on this, I thought that I had not long before that read it again, and so I was like, well, there's a good phrase to use, and I'll unpack it for you. So I actually changed the title a little bit of my outline, Trusting in the Tameness of a Wolf, Obama's Mad Middle East Policy. So maybe that makes it a little palatable for some of you. All right, so I just want to talk about a few things, and then we'll take some questions. And one of the things I want to do is talk a little bit about domestic policy, because, you know, considering the issue, you can't really separate domestic and foreign policies when it comes to the Middle East and the Islamic world. So, but I'll focus mainly on foreign policy because that was my task. Now, as you know, most of us know, Obama came into office, and one of his biggest, if not his biggest, foreign policy goal was to do a reset with the Islamic world, right? Because of course Bush had ruined everything for everyone, and he, well, remember, before he even did much of anything, he'd already been awarded a Nobel Prize, so his very existence made things better. But if you remember, his first major foreign policy trip and speech was what? It was the Cairo speech in, I believe, June of 2009. So he started right out of the box with trying to do things, as he saw it, with improving relations with the Islamic world. And just quickly, some Pew data on that. The latest Pew data is from July of 2013, but this sure hasn't worked. The U.S. favorability rating in most Muslim countries is down from what it was when when Bush was president. 21% in Turkey, Egypt and the Palestinian territories about 16%, and Pakistan 11%. So most Muslim countries are a little bit higher. A lot of them are a little bit higher than that, but none of them is very high. And in fact, the situation, I dare say, if they did another poll now, it would be even worse, particularly with Obama's crazy vacillations back and forth on Egypt in particular. So now, you know, as a person who studies what I study, I'm kind of concerned about that, but I care a lot more about what the American people think about the president and his policies. And, you know, I think it's safe to say, without going too much into data, we can all find that for ourselves, not hard to find. The president's viewed at best as incompetent by many Americans when it comes to foreign policy, and at worst as dangerous. Probably more of the latter predominates in this room. And, you know, as a quick aside, I don't want to get into that boggy morass about whether he's a Muslim or not. I don't think he's a Muslim. I think his policies are such that he may as well be. I just happen to think he's a lousy Christian. But there are, you know, the last data on this was a year or two ago, and something like 1 in 6 Americans thinks that Obama is a Muslim. So, now domestically, I don't know if any of you read PJ Media. I had an article 2 weeks ago in PJ Media talking about this. Mark, so I don't know if anyone else did, but I think I sent it to Michael. But it was an article expounding on the fact that a couple of weeks ago, a couple of days before I wrote the article, the Attorney General was issuing new directives, gave a talk and issued new directives. Actually, they weren't that new. I think they were just finally something, policy that was explicitly spelled out. The policy that from now on, in any Department of Justice investigations, you could not consider, the first part of it was you could not consider, you could not focus on Hispanics when it came to issues dealing with illegal immigration, although 81% of illegal immigrants or undocumented workers or whatever other term you should use in this country, are from Mexico or from another Latin American country. But you can no longer focus on Latin American background and ancestry in that area. More importantly, I think, although that's important enough, and more importantly and more germane to what I'm talking about, is that the administration has now explicitly said you cannot consider Islamic belief in counterterrorism investigations. And beyond that, I mean, the ludicrousness becomes just squared and cubed. It is considered, Islam is considered a race now. A doctrinal system, this is to be something new in the history of the world, a doctrinal system, a belief system, is now equated with skin color. So this was explicitly put out by Holder several weeks ago. So, and you know, when you have these sorts of domestic policies in place, absurd as they of course are going to be reflected in foreign policy as well. Now, I mean, this should be really no big surprise. For a couple of examples, remember a few years ago when Quran burning was being done by certain people, particularly Pastor Terry Jones down in Florida, the administration inevitably and always took the side against him, against the First Amendment, and in favor of basically the Muslim idea that you should not offend a religion. Although there seems to be only one religion that is protected from being offended in this country. It is the religion of 0.6% of Americans. If you remember the famous hearing a couple of years ago, I believe it was Representative Lamar Smith from Texas, had a hearing, and the Attorney General was there. And the Attorney General, after repeated questioning, would refuse to say that the underwear bomber or the failed Times Square bomber or any other fill-in-the-blank bomber trying to wage jihad, he would refuse to say that anything had anything to do with Islam. So, and as you know, I think I've spoken about before here, and also I wrote about in the article in PJ Media, there has been a virtual ban, not virtual, there's a ban on discussion of Islam and jihad in counterterrorism instruction. And I think I mentioned to you that I myself got closed out of 2 positions, one lecturing at Joint Special Operations University and another lecturing at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center down in Glencoe, because I dared in a course of instruction called History of Terrorism to talk about Islamic terrorism. So I was closed out, and I know lots of other people, and you probably read the media about some of the ones that have. Now, this is domestically the case. Of course, again, as I've said, this is going to be reflected in foreign policy because this all comes from the top down. And I'm going to talk about some examples, and then I'll talk briefly about why I think this is the case. Specifically, you know, some people would say, I still have people ask me, well, why would you focus on Islam when you're dealing with terrorism? I guess these are people that live in a cave without internet access, or they are illiterate. But the State Department Foreign Terrorist Organization list, which was just updated a few weeks ago, currently has 57 organizations on it. 38 of them are Islamic, right? Islamic in motivation, goals, and ideology. And again, not by my definition, by their own definition. 2/3 of the terrorist groups in the world, according to our group, and there are other lists. I mean, other countries have terrorist lists, other organizations. But our State Department one is probably the most prestigious and perhaps well-researched one. 2/3 of the groups on the list are Muslim. And there could actually be several more that aren't on there. For instance, several of the Syrian groups, Jabhat al-Nusra and some of the groups that are active in Syria are not on the list, although they should be. So, Global Terrorism Database, which the University of Maryland runs, goes back to 1970. I ran a search there for Islamic terrorism between 1970 and 2013. Over 5,000 entries came up. If you run a search for Christian terrorism, you get 14. So, and as I've said before, some of those probably aren't really Christian terrorism. They're several guys in a pub in Northern Ireland with access to a fax machine. But emphasis on the pub, exactly. But for instance, the State Department list has 2 nominally Christian groups, and they're both Northern Ireland groups that really aren't even active. There's a Jewish group on there too. And Maher Kahana, who is the progenitor of this group, was killed some years ago. The group hasn't done anything in years, but I'm convinced the State Department just wants to have a Jewish group on the list, so they had to do this. So, and again, I've unpacked this before. I won't go into this. I would probably, to some extent, be preaching to the choir here. Many of you are well versed in this to some extent, and But as I've said before, jihad is not extremist in Islam. Jihad, frankly, is mainstream in Islam. Right? The idea of jihad was practiced by Muhammad himself. It's practiced. It is recommended in the Quran, and it is a staple, certainly, of Sunni theology. Shia theology, it's a little different, but certainly of Sunni theology it is. So it's absurd, and I brought this up, I don't know, I was on Fox News for a whole 38 seconds last August. Catherine Herridge interviewed me about Major Hassan down in Texas right before his trial, right before his sentencing. And it was funny because Ms. Herridge, who I think is quite good and quite knowledgeable, I'm sure many of you know who she is, didn't seem to like some of the things I was saying. I mean, I don't know if she was just playing devil's advocate, but I was pointing out that the ideas that Major Malik Hassan was espousing in these written documents that he turned over to Fox News and then she'd asked me to look at, I said, well, these aren't extremists. These are mainstream jihad going back 1,434 years in Islamic history. The fact that they resemble the Taliban and Boko Haram in Nigeria and other Islamic groups like that, maybe that should tell you something. Maybe these groups, aren't as extremist as we try to make them out to be. So, the problem with what the administration is doing with specific countries, and I'm going to talk briefly about Egypt, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and a little bit about Iran. The problem is that the administration refuses to acknowledge the realities of Islamic history and Islamic doctrines, specifically this one dealing with jihad. Now look at Egypt, for example. In Egypt, Egypt has been ruled by a string, basically, of sort of benevolent dictators, I guess we could say, going back to ever since they got independence from the British in 1952. Of course, Egypt is the largest Arab country. It's about 90% Muslim, about 10% Christian, Coptic Christian. And the Muslim Brotherhood developed many years ago, and finally, through grassroots organizing and that sort of thing, actually did win the election. I will have to give the Muslim Brotherhood that. They did win the election. And I think I've mentioned before that I found it a bit problematic. I do find it still a bit problematic that you force out a government that won an election. On the other hand, people could counter, yes, but Hitler won an election, didn't he? Yes, that's true. The problem is that the administration pretty much took the side of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, wants an Islamic state. The Muslim Brotherhood developed in Egypt back in the 1930s, and over the last 70, 80 years has spread to most Arab countries, and in fact has spread to many non-Arab Muslim countries. In Africa, even in places like Indonesia. The Muslim Brotherhood, despite what many people say, is not a terrorist organization, right? In the sense that we mean terrorist, which means blowing up things and killing people. The Muslim Brotherhood certainly is a very strongly Islamic organization, and which I think is a greater threat in the long run, because they want Islamic states. Now, so what we found is an administration that basically supported this transnational Islamic movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, in Egypt and in other places, over against the governments. And the governments, Mubarak and now General al-Sisi, that are basically more westernized and more I can't say that Egypt is any longer our ally, since they're so mad about what happened with the Obama support for the Muslim Brotherhood. But they could be our ally, and they could get along with us a lot better than they do if the administration simply would stop supporting their opponents. Syria. Syria, of course, is a bloody mess, much bloodier than Egypt because there's a civil war going on there. And what a lot of people don't understand is, for all of the nastiness and unsavoriness of the regime, the al-Assad ruled regime, that is basically also, in many ways, a religious fight. The group that runs Syria, the al-Assad family, are Alawis. They are not, strictly speaking, Muslims. They are a weird offshoot of Shia Islam that developed in the 10th century AD. They are considered by most Sunni Muslims to be what's called murtadun, apostates. And there have been fatwas over the years put on their heads. The Alawis ran a secular government under the elder Assad and then under the younger Assad now. Yes, it was a brutal dictatorship in many ways, but it was a secular dictatorship because the Alawis ruled as secularists. Ba'ath Party, in fact, the Arab Socialist Party, which is the same party that Saddam Hussein used to belong to. About 7, 8, 9% of the population of Syria is Christian. The Alawis make up about 11%. The other 75, 80% is Sunni Muslim. And many people, me included, believe that if al-Assad goes down, the Alawis will be slaughtered en masse, and many of the Christians will probably be slaughtered. In fact, many of the Christians are being killed now, if you follow the news, in areas where Jabhat al-Nusra and what's called ISIS, Dawlat al-Islamiyya al-Iraq wa al-Sham, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, places where these two groups in particular have taken over, Christians are being killed, churches are being burned, that sort of thing. So I have no great love at all for al-Assad, but it is true, it's an unpleasant reality of foreign policy, but it's true that sometimes the devil you know is better than the one you don't, or the devil in power is better than the one that wants to be in power. But what's the administration done there? The administration has really, they did finally decide against bombing, and they were outsmarted in many ways by Vladimir Putin. Okay?
Go Putin.
It is interesting, and I never thought I'd say this since I'm a child of the Cold War, but I can't believe that I actually live in a world where the president of Russia speaks up for Christians more than the president of the United States. But that is the world we live in. But in Syria, basically, the administration has, again, taken the side of the Sunni. In this case, it's not so much the Brotherhood, it's what are called the Salafis. The real Islamic fundamentalists, the guys with the long beards who want strict Islamic law and don't wear suits. The Muslim Brotherhood at least has enough sense to put on nice suits and wear nice ties and trim their beards. The Salafis don't. Let me just quickly say that we have to be careful about this trap, though, that a lot of analysts fall into, particularly on our side, of conflating everything into Al-Qaeda, all right? All Islamic fundamentalists are not Al-Qaeda, right? So let's not make that mistake, because the administration does it like as if Al-Qaeda were our only problem. Al-Qaeda is just the tip of the spear, folks. There's lots more than that. Again, if you look at that list I just mentioned, 38 foreign terrorist organizations, I think 4 of them are Al-Qaeda so-called franchises or regional organizations. So that means most of them are not. So keep that in mind. And there are a lot of folks on our side that tend to fall into that too. Well, nominally on our side anyway. I'm not sure what McCain is anymore. I'm not sure McCain knows where McCain is anymore. But
What's the date?
Afghanistan's a bloody mess. You saw recently where Karzai, in order to curry favor with the tribes, because he's already looking at what's going to happen when we leave, Karzai is accusing us of funding the Taliban. Well, I don't think we fund the Taliban. It is true, however, that for several years the administration has been having talks with the moderate Taliban. And I often say moderate Taliban is sort of like, saying moderate Nazi or something. I don't think there is such a thing. You're a Taliban or you're not. Iraq. Even CNN recently admitted, one of their correspondents, almost fell out of my chair, that Iraq is worse now than it was when we left. Over 8,000 people were killed last year. It's basically installed a Shia government because about 65% of Iraq is Shia. It's basically falling into Iran's orbit, more or less. I don't think it will totally, because Arabs are not Persians, and they do have that, but they are co-religionists with the Ayatollahs in Tehran. Meanwhile, over in the western part of the country, large sections of the western part of the country around Al-Anbar have been taken over by the aforementioned ISIS, who is trying to create a caliphate that straddles the border between Iraq and Syria. And then there's Iran, which is, something different because Iran is Persian and has been our enemy since 1979. But even there, the administration, I think a lot of people have been focused lately on the fact that the administration has just kind of gone off the rails with this whole nuclear deal with Iran. I don't know if, I often wonder if John Kerry is really that stupid. But, yeah.
No, he isn't.
It's hard to think he's that stupid. It's hard to think anyone's that stupid. But
You did go to Yale.
the president
Oh, yeah.
clearly wants a deal, wanted some kind of deal with Iran, and they also seem to some extent to fall under the spell of the so-called moderate Rouhani, the new president. I mean, the day after the guy was elected, I did a little research on him, actually before he was elected, and looked up, and he'd been a younger protege of Khomeini, the guy that basically started the revolution in Iran back in the early days. And if you look at, although he speaks English, and I don't know if this has ever been confirmed, but supposedly Rouhani has a PhD from a Scottish university, which I guess means he sort of speaks English. But if you look at his published writings, they're all books on Twelver Shia Islam and Islamic jurisprudence, and there's not a whole lot on anything moderate. The man's not moderate, he's just a kinder, gentler, Ayatollah who still supports the clerical rule over there. So the administration has totally been, I think, willingly snookered by Rouhani on this issue. And remember a few years ago when they had the election, and Mousavi was going to run for prime minister, or president, I should say, and there was the so-called Green Revolution in Iran, and people were marching in the streets, and it seemed to sort of echo the Arab Revolution that was going on. The administration did nothing to support those people. So. Now just real quickly, why is he pursuing such madness? And I've touched on this a little bit before. I have my theories. I try to avoid conspiracy theorizing as much as I can and apply Occam's razor. But basically, he has a bunch of advisors who belong to Islamic groups, some the Muslim Brotherhood, who are advising him. The Director of Counterintelligence, John Brennan. I have a friend that retired from the CIA who says that the chatter was that John Brennan actually converted to Islam when he was station chief in Riyadh. I don't know if that's true, but again, like with Obama, it may as well be, because he's on record as saying things like, jihad does not mean what most of the world's Muslims say it means. And he doesn't have the excuse that a Holder or an Obama would have where they're not area experts. I mean, Brennan speaks Arabic and has a master's degree, I believe, in Middle East studies. So I think he knows better. Ideology, I think, has a lot to do with this. Briefly, I think that, for the left, capital L, for the left, capital L, the only oppressive religion that's ever existed is Christianity. I mean, this goes back to Voltaire and others in the Enlightenment. And then, especially if you're hard left, like this president and many in the administration are, you've got a heavy dose of Marx infused into that. And of course, for Marx, the enemy was always the church, right? No other religions could be oppressive or patriarchal or misogynistic or fill in the blank, only Christianity. So, geopolitics is active here. We still get a lot of oil from Muslim countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, and all those Saudis are very happy with Obama. They still are one of our major suppliers of oil, so I think that's part of what's going on. And as I mentioned, also the administration is a big fan of the Muslim Brotherhood, so they're influenced by that. And then I think a big part of it with Obama himself is just simply hubris. I think he is convinced, because of who he is, well, we already know he has a very high opinion of himself. I think he has a particularly high opinion of himself when it comes to Islam in the Middle East because of his background. I think he is convinced that he knows the Middle East better than anybody else in American history ever could. And I think that he is, his view is the right way, and that he's going to go ahead, facts be damned. Facts like how many terrorist groups are Muslim and that sort of thing. So, just briefly, I think, what would a more sane policy look like? Well, one thing is I think you would stand up for minorities, persecuted minorities, Christians, but also persecuted Islamic minorities. There's several Islamic minorities that are fairly moderate minorities. I'll grant you they're minorities. Make up maybe 100 million of the world's 1.5 billion Muslims. But groups like the Ahmadis in Indonesia and Pakistan, the Alawis in Syria, they get a bad name because the guy in charge of the country is a real, forgive my French, bastard. But that doesn't mean all Alawis are like that. That doesn't mean that all, 1.5 million of them, or whatever it is, deserve to die. Ismaili Muslims, who are another sect of the Shia, are persecuted in many places, like Afghanistan. And I think standing up for groups like that, as well as, of course, for persecuted Christians throughout the Middle East, who, again, another study just came out last week, the most persecuted religious group in the world is Christians. The left doesn't like to hear that because, again, or acknowledge it, because to the left, Christians are only oppressors. They can't possibly be, or if they are persecuted, it's probably their own fault, right? This is how many in the left tend to see it. I've actually read articles like that. But I think if we had an administration actually stood up for minorities on a regular basis, like for instance, I watched the National Prayer Breakfast last week and Obama talked. And, he sort of dumbed it down and leveled it. I mean, I really have to do a little bit of this when you're president. But he sort of leveled into, he did mention persecution of religious groups, but, he mentioned as many persecuted Muslim groups as he did Christian groups, for instance, which is not even close to the reality of what's going on. And I think the flip side of that is if you had a foreign policy, if you had a State Department to do something like that, you would, to some extent, sort of delegitimize Sunni groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafi groups, the Taliban, those groups, any group with jihad in its title, or Ansar al-Din, Ansar, there are a lot of groups in Africa, North Africa called Ansar al-something. Ansar means the companions of Muhammad. So you would delegitimize them because you would point out, wait a minute, you can't even tolerate your own minority religious groups. You need to work on that before you talk about Muslims being tolerated by other people. The big thing, of course, is something that, of course, a pipe dream that will never happen now, maybe in a future administration someday. Acknowledge that there's a problem in Islam that needs to be dealt with. And talk about it honestly, because jihad is a doctrine that needs to be dealt with. So, and I will just end with this. The whole quote from Lear, and again, forgive me, but it's Shakespeare, not me. The fool tells Lear he's mad that trusts in the tameness of a wolf, a horse's health, a boy's love, or a whore's oath. And the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafis, the wolf in my metaphor here, they can't be tamed, all right? You can kill a lot of them with drones. That's a good thing. Particularly the Salafis, the Wahhabis, the hardcore jihadists. But ultimately, you sort of have to cage that wolf, and you can't tame it, but I think you have to cage it till it dies out. It may take decades. It may take centuries. I hope it will eventually die out. But that's something that Muslims are going to have to deal with, not us. And they're going to have to do, really, not us. Eric Holder or Obama or anyone else saying what Islam is and isn't is just absurd. Especially when they don't deal with reality. Under Bush, at least, the horse metaphor, we were a strong horse. Maybe we weren't liked, but we were feared and respected, right? Obama's trying to be loved, and he's neither loved nor respected. He's the weak horse. And the last thing, the whore's oath, there is a policy in Islam called taqiyya, or kitman, where you can lie to non-believers. There's a doctrine of Islam that goes back, to the early days of Islam, and I think it would do us well if some people would acknowledge that, instead of, it's often portrayed as something that conservatives slander Muslims with. No, it's a doctrine of Islam that's been around for a long time. So, So at this point, or at best, his fool in office. So I'm hoping in the future we'll get a Henry V, but I won't hold my breath. So, all right, that's it. Thank you.